Are you sure you really know what the Great Wall of China is? And, more importantly, exactly what it was built for? This question might seem strange because from our school days, we've been told about a grand defensive structure designed to protect civilization from barbarian raids. However, you only need to dig a little deeper for the official version to start crumbling, leaving behind only confusion. A few years ago, heated debates erupted online. Attentive researchers noticed that on certain sections, the battlements and arrow slits face not outward, but inward, toward China itself, as if the wall wasn't meant to keep an external enemy out, but to keep someone in. Of course, skeptics immediately claimed this was an error of interpretation, but where there's smoke, there's fire. My personal experience with this monument in 2012, when I visited sections of the wall near Beijing and in Sichuan province near the city of Chengdu, only strengthened these doubts. You are presented with a structure that defies all military logic in its location and design. Why was the wall routed exactly this way? Why spend colossal resources building in uninhabited, impassable mountains, where it is practically impossible to pass even without a wall? Before we start unraveling this historical detective story and destroying familiar myths, hit that subscribe button and like this video so you don't miss the truth about our past. A truth often hidden behind the polished facades of textbooks. If we view the wall purely as a defensive object, we inevitably hit a logical dead end. The first and most obvious question is economic feasibility. The wall was erected in wild mountain regions, which increased construction costs tenfold, if not 100-fold, compared to building on the plains. Builders had to transport materials to enormous heights and provide housing and food for hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of workers. A reasonable question arises. If the state was in danger, wouldn't it have been simpler to spend these gigantic funds on creating a professional army? Instead of carving stone in the mountains, they could have forged pickaxes into swords, created a powerful, well-armed force capable of repelling any attack at the borders without erecting cyclopean structures. Official history paints a picture of constant confrontation. On one side, a peaceful China. On the other, aggressive nomads, presumably Mongols, who raided their neighbors for decades, taking people into slavery. We are led to believe that the Chinese, tired of the raids, decided to build a wall. But here's the catch. Construction on this scale lasts for centuries. Did the nomads, realizing their food source would soon be cut off, simply sit back and watch the barrier go up? Logic suggests they should have thrown all their forces into stopping the construction. Yet, the wall was finished. Here, historians usually argue that Chinese troops protected the construction. But this creates another paradox. If the Chinese army was strong enough to protect a construction site stretching thousands of kilometers for decades, defending workers from constant raids by mobile enemy units, then why did they need the wall at all? They were already handling the situation perfectly fine. If the army was weak and couldn't protect the country, which was the alleged reason for building the wall, then how could they ensure the safety of such a massive project? It becomes a vicious circle. Either the wall isn't needed because the army is strong, or the wall couldn't be built because the army is weak. Moreover, the location itself is baffling. The wall runs along the very peaks of mountain ridges, in places where even a modern tourist finds it extremely difficult to reach. Roads to the wall were paved quite recently, and only for tour buses. On the enemy side, there are sheer cliffs and precipices. Why build fortifications where nature itself created an insurmountable barrier? If we assume the enemy attacked through the mountains, the question of physical possibility arises. Blocking the plains with a wall or troops is logical, but stretching a continuous line of defense along the crests of cliffs hundreds of meters high, where there are no roads or water sources, seems like the height of absurdity. It is unlikely that ancient strategists were so foolish as to defend impassable rocks, wasting resources where the enemy would never pass. Apparently, the true purpose of this grand object lies in a completely different plane, far removed from primitive defense against cavalry. If we accept the official version as truth, the entire concept of construction begins to look like strategic and economic madness with no parallel in world history. Let's try to look at this project not through the eyes of a historian rewriting old chronicles, but through the eyes of a crisis manager or military strategist. We are faced with a picture of a colossal expenditure of resources which, it would seem, should have bled the state dry rather than saved it. Building a wall in remote, uninhabited, and rugged mountain areas is a logistical nightmare even for modern technology, let alone in ancient times. Imagine the scale of the task. You don't just need to gather millions of workers, but also provide them with tools, clothing, housing, and, most importantly, food. Nothing grows in the mountains, which means food must be delivered hundreds of kilometers over rough terrain. The cost of maintaining such an army of builders is many times greater than the cost of maintaining a military army. A legitimate question arises. If the goal was protection from an aggressor, wouldn't it have been more logical to direct these resources toward armaments? Why give people pickaxes and shovels, forcing them to haul stones to the tops of ridges, if you could forge that metal into swords and spears, train these same people in warfare, and create mobile, powerful border garrisons? A well-armed army capable of maneuvering and meeting the enemy on the approaches is always more effective than a static wall, which, as we know, can be bypassed or breached. But for some reason, ancient rulers chose the longest, most expensive, and least effective path. The behavior of the enemy raises even more questions. We are told the wall was built to protect against nomads, fierce, fast, and ruthless, who terrorized China for centuries. But let's simulate the situation. Building the wall is not a quick process. It dragged on for centuries. What were the nomads doing all this time? According to official logic, they should have realized, as soon as the last brick is laid, their business of looting neighbors would end. Their vital interests were under threat. However, judging by the fact that the wall was indeed finished, the nomads for some reason decided not to interfere. They seemed to take the position of outside observers, patiently waiting for decades while the Chinese erected an insurmountable barrier to cut them off from their loot forever. You must agree, this behavior does not fit the image of aggressive conquerors at all. Either the nomads were the most patient and short-sighted strategists in history, or the wall wasn't built against them at all. Here we run into an unsolvable dilemma of strength. Historians claim that troops guarded the construction site, but if the Chinese army was capable of securing a gigantic construction site stretched over thousands of kilometers, protecting workers from constant raids by flying enemy squads, it means this army was already the dominant force in the region. If you can cover the construction project of the century, you can simply defeat the enemy. Then why do you need a wall? You've already won. If the Chinese army was weak and couldn't handle the raids, which was supposedly the reason for construction, the nomads simply wouldn't have allowed a single kilometer of fortifications to be built. They would have slaughtered the workers, destroyed the foundations, and burned the camps. It is impossible to build the world's greatest structure right under the nose of a strong enemy without having overwhelming military superiority. The result is a paradox. A weak China couldn't have built the wall, and a strong China wouldn't have needed it just in case. But even if we discard economics and strategy, and assume that by some miracle the wall was built for defense, a physical aspect remains that destroys all theories. The wall doesn't just run along the border, it winds along the very peaks, along the crests of mountain ranges. The altitude of some sections reaches points where it is hard to breathe, and the climb there takes hours, even for a prepared person carrying no load. Gentle roads do not lead there. On the enemy side, there are sheer cliffs and abysses. Who did they need to defend against at an altitude of 2,000 or 3,000 meters, in a terrain that is itself a death trap for any army? Who is this mysterious enemy capable of storming the heavens, and why did ancient engineers decide that vertical cliffs weren't enough, and they needed to add a few more meters of stone masonry on top? The answer to this question forces us to reconsider the very concept of the enemy and the capabilities of those who supposedly threaten China. Let's step away from dry textbook lines for a moment and try to model a real military situation in the conditions where the Great Wall is laid. Let's imagine a hypothetical invasion as it is described to us. A huge horde of nomads moves toward China's borders to seize the riches of the Celestial Empire. The flat sections are blocked by garrisons, and the only path remaining is those very mountains along the ridges of which the stone ribbon snakes. To understand the absurdity of this idea, we need to remember who nomads are. These are not infantry accustomed to forced marches. These are horsemen whose strength lies in maneuverability, speed, and unity with the horse. For them, the horse is not just transport, it is life, a weapon, and a means of survival. However, the mountains where the wall stands are a jumble of rocks, scree, and steep ascents. There were no roads there then, and there aren't any in many places now. Moving cargo on carts or wagons in such terrain is out of the question. Wheels would simply get stuck between boulders in the first kilometer. This means all army supplies, food, water, weapons, tents, spare clothes, must be carried in packs. Historical sources claim that Mongols often didn't shoe their horses due to a shortage of iron, preferring to take several spare horses on a campaign. But an unshod horse on rocky ground will wear its hooves down to the blood in a couple of days of travel. In high-altitude conditions, animals will start breaking their legs, falling into ravines, and collapsing from exhaustion. Very soon, the formidable cavalry will turn into a crowd of pedestrians burdened with dying animals. As soon as the horses are out of action, the nomads are forced to dismount. And here begins a real logistical catastrophe. For the army to remain combat ready, each warrior needs to carry a colossal weight. Imagine personal weapons, food supplies for at least a week, and a mountain campaign is not a quick affair. Camp tools, warm clothes for cold mountain nights. By the most modest estimates, the weight of the gear approaches 30 to 40 kilograms, 65 to 90 pounds. But the most critical resource becomes water. With physical exertion, a person needs at least 2 liters of water a day. In the mountains, streams can be dry, seasonal, or worse, poisoned by an enemy who knows of the approach. Carrying a water supply for an entire army in leather skins on one's back is impossible. This turns a military operation into extreme survival, where the main goal becomes not defeating China, but simply finding a sip of water. The idea that such an exhausted, dehydrated army that has lost its horses is capable of storming fortified positions sounds like fantasy. Moreover, these people would have to possess the skills of professional mountaineers. They would have to scramble up sheer slopes, carrying heavy backpacks, without modern equipment, maps, or GPS. Even modern elite special forces units, equipped with advanced gear and aviation support, would consider the task of storming such heights extremely risky and perhaps impossible. Yet we are asked to believe that steppe dwellers, accustomed to open spaces and flat land, performed such feats en masse. But let's assume the incredible. They overcame the ridges, descended into the valley, and even managed to loot something. The return scenario looks even more ridiculous. They need to climb back up those same cliffs, but now they are burdened with loot and, inevitably, the wounded. In any traditional army, they try not to leave their own behind, especially commanders. Hauling wounded comrades and looted gold up cliffs while escaping the pursuit of fresh Chinese cavalry is suicide. Such a raid carries no strategic benefit. Personnel losses would be catastrophic. It turns out that nature itself created an ideal defensive line in this region. The mountains are a wall in themselves, impossible to overcome with large forces. No army of that time could physically organize a large-scale invasion across these ridges. And since the enemy couldn't pass there, why did the Chinese, with a persistence worthy of a better cause, build a wall there? Why fortify what is already impregnable? If we discard the version of defense against non-existent mountaineer nomads, we are left alone with the fact. The wall stands where, from a military point of view, it is absolutely useless. Which means the answer to the riddle of its purpose lies not in warfare tactics, but in the construction of this cyclopean object itself, which upon closer inspection turns out to be not at all what it seems. If you get up close to the Great Wall and cast aside tourist enthusiasm, an attentive eye will immediately stumble upon oddities that are impossible to explain within the framework of the usual historical model. We are used to perceiving this structure as a single, monolithic project created according to one plan. However, reality shows us two completely different objects joined together, like a Frankenstein of the architectural world. The lower part of the wall, its foundation and base, is often made of massive granite blocks. This is megalithic masonry, requiring the highest level of craftsmanship, complex tools for cutting hard rock, and advanced logistics to deliver multi-ton blocks to dizzying heights. The granite is laid evenly, often on a horizontal level, creating a perfectly smooth and durable base that has stood for millennia. But what lies above, the actual wall with battlements and arrow slits, is made of ordinary fired brick. The contrast between these two technologies is striking. The brickwork looks much more primitive. It often does not observe a strict level, following the terrain more chaotically. This suggests that the brick part is merely a later superstructure, a decoration, or a restoration attempt made by people who no longer possess the technology to process granite on an industrial scale. One gets the impression that Chinese builders, or those who claim authorship, simply found an ancient, grandiose granite foundation of unknown purpose in the mountains and decided to finish it by building a brick fence on top to give the object some understandable meaning. Questions about where the ancient quarries are, where they got so much granite, and where the tools capable of processing hard rock so cleanly are, remain unanswered. We see the result of industrial-level work at the bottom and artisanal craft at the top. Even more doubts about the defensive purpose of the wall are raised by its towers. From a distance, they look impressive, but inside, they turn out to be completely dysfunctional for warfare. The rooms in these towers are so cramped that a few people can barely fit, and likely only while sitting. Where are the garrison soldiers supposed to sleep? Where do they store arrows, provisions, and water? In some towers, there aren't even basic stone stairs between levels. It is hard to imagine a fortification where defenders must scramble to the upper floor on makeshift wooden ladders or ropes in the heat of battle. This slows down maneuvers and makes defense ineffective. Such a layout is more suitable for technical rooms, storage closets, or observation points, but certainly not for autonomous fortresses designed to withstand an enemy onslaught. Plaques on some sections indicating reconstruction in the 19th century only confirm the guess. What we see today is largely a replica created to establish a specific historical myth. The failure of the wall as a military object was noted not only by modern skeptics, but also by recognized scholars. The famous historian and ethnologist Lev Gumilev pointed directly to the pointlessness of this structure for China. His argument is simple and deadly. The length of the wall is so great that all the armed forces of the country would not be enough to organize an effective defense on it. If you place garrisons in every tower, these small detachments will be destroyed by the enemy faster than neighbors can arrive to help. If you concentrate large forces in major forts, huge undefended gaps form between them, through which the enemy can slip unnoticed. In the end, the wall turns into a monument to wasted labor that cannot stop an army or even small sabotage groups. So what is before us, if not a fortress wall? We have a continuous ribbon stretching for thousands of kilometers, possessing a complex, high-tech granite base laid through inaccessible mountains. An object that requires horizon leveling but makes no sense as a fortification. If we remove the brick battlements and arrow slits added later from the equation, the design begins to resemble a completely different type of engineering structure. It is something that must be long, durable, and continuous. Something that we build today but use for completely different purposes. Not to keep someone out, but to move something along. And this guess opens the door to a world of ancient technologies we were never told about. If we decisively reject the military doctrine as untenable, a space opens up to search for other, more pragmatic reasons for erecting such a grandiose object. When a civilization spends astronomical resources on construction, there is usually economic gain behind it that cannot be achieved any other way. What remains if we remove the shield function? The function of a bridge or road remains. Look at the map of the Great Wall from a different angle. Not as a border separating peoples, but as an artery connecting points of interest. And here, geography gives us a surprising clue. The route of the wall runs through specific regions that are known even today for their rich deposits of minerals. The famous colored sands and rock formations of these places are not just a beautiful landscape, but direct markers of ore bodies coming to the surface. It is quite likely that ancient engineers knew geology perfectly well and built their object in the immediate vicinity of resource extraction sites. In this context, the wall transforms from a passive barrier into an active transport system, a gigantic, high-tech highway of antiquity created to export valuable raw materials. This hypothesis brilliantly explains one of the main oddities of the design: the granite base leveled to the horizon. For foot soldiers or even horsemen, a perfect horizontal is not a critical necessity. An army can overcome ascents and descents, but for heavy transport, a flat surface is vital. Imagine something like an ancient railway, or rather, a stone track along which carts carrying ore, silver, or concentrate traveled. Perhaps wooden rails or even metal tracks once lay on the granite blocks, traces of which have long disappeared or were melted down by subsequent generations. The double lines of walls found in some sections, which are meaningless from a defensive point of view, make clear sense in the transport theory. These could be tracks in two directions. There empty and back with cargo, or the separation of flows of different raw materials. Such a road solved the main problem of mountain mining: logistics. Hauling tons of rock off-road on carts is impossible, but sending them along a specially prepared, reinforced embankment that smooths out the terrain is an engineeringly sound solution. The wall connected mines with processing plants or metallurgical centers located in more convenient valleys. This turns the Great Wall into an analog of modern industrial conveyors or railway lines leading to quarries. However, as with any theory, there is a but here that prevents us from resting entirely on the road version. The problem lies in the continuity of the wall in absolutely impassable sections. If it is simply a road for transporting cargo on wagons or carts, why stretch it over sharp peaks and sheer cliffs where the gradient becomes critical? In the most difficult places, it would have been more logical to cut a tunnel, make a serpentine path, or install a lifting mechanism. But the builders stubbornly erected a solid stone ribbon repeating the insane elevation changes, making movement along the surface of the wall in these points practically impossible for any transport. Wheels won't pass there, and draft animals won't keep their footing. This contradiction forces us to seek an explanation that goes beyond the usual understanding of roads. If cargo cannot be moved along the wall due to the steepness of the slopes, yet the wall is still built continuously and is hollow inside, as ruined sections show, a conclusion suggests itself that could overturn all our ideas about ancient engineering. Perhaps the main action did not take place on the surface, open to all winds, but was hidden deep within the masonry, where completely different physical principles of transportation operated. And this version, however fantastic it may seem at first glance, has serious technical justification. If we assume that moving cargo along the surface was physically impossible in the steepest and most dangerous places, the only logical conclusion remains that the movement happened inside. Let's cast aside everything we were told about fortification for a minute and look at the Great Wall as an engineering and technical structure. What if it's not an obstacle for people, but a gigantic, continuous container? What if we are looking not at a wall, but at a colossal stone pipeline or a protective casing for one? Structurally, this looks entirely justified. If we imagine that the granite base was originally laid out in the form of a trough, a long U-shaped channel which was then covered from above with heavy stone slabs, we get an ideal protected pipe. Subsequently, centuries or millennia later, when the true purpose was forgotten, brick battlements could have been built on top of this structure, turning the lid of a technical box into a fighting platform. The voids inside the ruins of the wall that researchers often find, filled with packed earth or rubble, could be the remains of that very internal space through which a flow once ran. This idea is not something unique or impossible for the ancient world. History knows examples where our ancestors created complex hydraulic systems from the most unexpected materials. In Peru and Turkey, fragments of ancient stone aqueducts still exist, executed with jewelry-like precision, where blocks are fitted so tightly they hold water without mortar. Even in later times, in an era we consider primitive, wooden pipes were used to transport gas. Hollowed-out tree trunks coated with clay for tightness. If such technologies existed locally, why do we deny ancient builders the ability to implement them on a global scale? The Chinese wall, with its stone box, could be the pinnacle of this engineering thought. The most intriguing question is, what could flow through this transcontinental artery? Mountains are a storehouse of resources. Water could be supplied through the pipe to arid regions, which in itself is more valuable than gold. But given the monumentality of the construction, one can assume more specific tasks. Perhaps it was the transportation of energy carriers, oil or natural gas, outcrops of which are also found in these parts. Gas is easy to pump through a sealed channel over long distances. An even bolder, but technically elegant version says that it was part of a mining and processing cycle. A special solution with dissolved rock or slurry, a mixture of water and crushed ore, could flow inside the wall. This would solve the problem of transporting raw materials from high mountain mines down to the valleys to processing sites. Gravity would do all the work on the descents, and pumping systems would be required on the ascents. And here we approach one of the most mysterious finds, officially called ancient Chinese cannons. You can see these metal objects in museums and on the wall itself. But if you look at them through the eyes of an engineer, not a military historian, they cause bewilderment. These guns have strange ring-shaped thickenings and narrowings, resembling flange connections or stiffening ribs for high pressure. They often have no trunnions, protrusions for mounting on a carriage, which makes aiming and firing them impossible. Instead, they look exactly like parts of high-pressure industrial pumps, pieces of pipeline valves, or elements of drilling rigs. The quality of their manufacture is astounding. Traces of machining indicate that these parts were turned on gigantic lathes, achieving perfect symmetry and smoothness. If the wall's towers were not barracks, but pumping stations, raw material heating points, or flow branching nodes, then the presence of such equipment there becomes understandable. The cramped rooms of the towers are ideally suited for housing mechanisms and maintenance personnel, not a garrison. And the cannons we see today are, perhaps, surviving fragments of that very high-tech system, which later, when the machine stopped, locals tried to adapt as primitive firearms. This theory paints a picture that takes your breath away. Instead of primitive feudal squabbles, we see traces of a global industrial civilization capable of extracting and transporting resources in industrial volumes through the most complex terrain. But who could build and maintain such a system in times when, according to textbooks, the limit of technology was a bow, an arrow, and a cart? Who possessed knowledge of hydraulics, geology, and metal turning long before the Industrial Revolution? The answer to this question could completely destroy the familiar chronology of human development. The Great Wall of China, for all its grandeur, is not a unique phenomenon that arose in a vacuum. If we accept the hypothesis that we are looking not at a defensive line, but at a complex industrial object, logic requires expanding the horizon of our search. Similar engineering anomalies, inexplicable from the point of view of the official chronology of technological development, are scattered all over the globe. The wall is just one puzzle piece in a global mosaic of forgotten history, traces of which we are accustomed to ignoring or attributing to the genius of ancient architects working with primitive tools. Take, for example, the hydraulic structures of Europe. In Spain, there is the Tibi gravity dam, the construction of which dates back to the late 16th century. Yet many similar objects in the region are attributed to the ancient Romans. Official history tells us about the ruina montium, ruin of the mountains, technology used by Romans to mine gold. The essence of the method was that engineers found a mountain presumably containing precious metal, built a complex system of aqueducts and reservoirs, and then released huge masses of water to literally wash away the rock and expose gold-bearing veins. The scale of earthworks and hydraulic works here is comparable to modern quarrying. The question arises, where did an ancient civilization possessing no machine power get such capabilities to move millions of tons of soil and water? An even more mysterious situation exists in Japan. Deep in the islands, there are ancient concrete and stone dams that function to this day. Yet the indigenous population of Japan is considered to be the Ainu, a people whose culture is described in official sources as quite primitive, based on hunting and gathering. Imagining that tribes living in harmony with nature suddenly decided to block rivers with cyclopean concrete structures is impossible. It contradicts their way of life and technological capabilities. As with the nomads at the walls of China, here we see a clear discrepancy between the complexity of the object and the level of development of the builders attributed to it. All these facts, the Chinese pipe, European hydrosystems, Japanese dams, form a single picture. We are observing the legacy of a single, highly developed global civilization that existed on Earth long before the historical events known to us. This was a society not of philosophers and poets, but of pragmatists, engineers, and geologists. Their main goal was the extraction and transportation of resources on an industrial scale. They possessed technologies that allowed them to change the planet's landscape, cut through mountains, drain rivers, and create infrastructure designed for millennia of operation. Likely, this civilization perished as a result of a global catastrophe, leaving behind only the most durable stone skeletons of its structures, factory husks, transport highway foundations, and giant pipelines. In this new paradigm, the role of Chinese dynasties, like many other builders of antiquity, changes radically. They were not the creators of the Great Wall. They became its heirs, or to be more precise, squatters. Imagine that after the fall of a high-tech world, survivors find a perfectly flat granite road or a stone box of incredible strength in the mountains. They don't know how to build it. They don't have tools to process granite. But they understand that this is an excellent base. The Chinese simply occupied these ruins. They used the granite foundation left over from the pipeline or road as a foundation. On top, using the primitive technologies available to them, they added brick walls, erected decorative turrets, and gave the structure the appearance of a fortress. This explains that very sharp contrast between the perfect polygonal masonry at the bottom and the rough brick at the top. By appropriating the authorship of the Cyclopean structure, the emperors legitimized their power and greatness, creating a myth that has gone unquestioned for centuries. We look at a complex industrial complex of a past era, remodeled by new tenants into a fence, and mistakenly believe that the fence stood here always. We have come a long way from schoolroom axioms to bold hypotheses, trying to unravel one of the grandest mysteries of our planet. Starting with doubts about the official version, which cracks under the pressure of elementary logic and physics, we have taken apart this historical construct step by step. We have seen that the idea of building a continuous stone wall at dizzying heights to protect against nomads is not just a strategic error, but a true absurdity. Imagining hordes of horsemen storming cliffs with climbing gear, or Chinese emperors spending centuries of budget on a senseless construction instead of an army, is only possible within the framework of a beautiful legend. Reality, harsh and pragmatic, points us to the fact that the true purpose of this colossus lies in the realm of technology and industry, not war. Now that we have discarded the impossible, we are left with the incredible, yet technically grounded. The Great Wall stands before us not as a shield, but as a complex ancient engineering facility. We stand at the crossroads of three main theories, each looking far more convincing than the fairy tale about Mongols. The first version: it is a global transport artery. A road leveled to the horizon allowed moving heavy loads, ore, and materials through impassable mountain ranges, connecting mining sites with processing centers. The second version, even more intriguing. It is a giant stone pipeline or protective casing for a main line, through which liquids, gas, or slurry were pumped. This theory explains the voids inside the wall and the strange tightness of the granite troughs. And finally, the third version. The wall could have served as a protective perimeter, but not for the state, but for specific industrial zones, closing off access to dangerous or secret resource extraction sites. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, and this object performed several functions at once, being part of a single planetary infrastructure. We must admit that official history is full of blank spots and gaping holes that have been covered for centuries by convenient but false explanations. The Great Wall of China is the biggest of these holes, literally and figuratively. It stands as a silent reproach to our arrogance, reminding us that civilizations possessing knowledge and capabilities we are only beginning to rediscover may have existed on Earth before us. We live on the ruins of giants, adapting their great creations to our modest needs, calling pumps cannons and pipelines fortress walls. Acknowledging this fact requires courage, as it forces us to rewrite textbooks and change our very perception of humanity's past. This investigation has come to an end, but the questions remain open. We have only lifted the veil of secrecy, and now it is your turn to draw your own conclusions based on what you've heard. Facts are stubborn things, and the granite blocks of the wall's base tell us much more than ink in chronicles. Do not be afraid to doubt and seek your own answers, because history is written not only by the victors, but also by those who know how to ask the right questions. So, which version seems the most plausible and logical to you? Was it a high-speed cargo road for ancient carts? Or perhaps a transcontinental pipeline for pumping energy and raw materials? Or do you still believe it is protection against mountaineer nomads who decided to conquer mountain peaks? Write your detailed opinion in the comments. We are very interested to hear your point of view. If this video made you think and look at familiar things from a new angle, be sure to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations. The truth is out there, and we will definitely find it. See you next time!